moved a little closer to midnight because the weapons became more and more powerful, and because a few years ago they told the world that it's not just nuclear war, but it's environmental catastrophe that could also doom humanity. But at some points, such as the end of the Cold War, the hand was moved back from midnight several minutes. And for me, that's very poignant because what we're going to discuss tonight in my professional life started 34 years ago when I became an advisor in this region to Ante Markovic in federal Yugoslavia in 1989, and to the Solidarity Movement in Poland, and to Mikhail Gorbachev, his economic team for the Soviet Union. And we thought then, 30 plus years ago, that the tensions would be reduced, and that Gorbachev, who for me is a hero, even though he's reviled by many in his own country, I think through a deep misunderstanding, but in any event, for me he's a hero because he was a person of peace. And maybe that's in a way why the Soviet Union ended, because he did not want to use force to hold things together. He wanted to use persuasion. But be that as it may, his idea was that there could be a peaceful, common European home. That was his great idea. And I signed up for that. I thought that really is a wonderful idea and a wonderful way to spend one's effort and one's time. And I got stuck with that idea 34 years ago, and I'm still completely stuck with it today. So I'm deeply frustrated by what's happening. And what we're going to discuss a bit is how we got from those very optimistic days to today. But just to make the point, what was 7 minutes to midnight in 1947, and then was, I think, 12 or even more minutes to midnight when they put the hands back further from disaster, is now, as of last week, 90 seconds to midnight. What the scientists are saying to us is a minute and a half to disaster. And what they're conveying by their announcement last week is that we are on the threshold of nuclear war, again, for the first time in 60 years since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in some ways more ominous now even than 60 years ago, because there's a hot war to start with. And this is a war between the United States and Russia, have no doubt, even though the soldiers dying in Ukraine are Ukrainian soldiers. The weapon systems and the intelligence and the sighting and the finance is all the United States and its allies. So this is a war between Russia and the United States already. And you don't want that between two nuclear superpowers. So that's the kind of grim occasion that we meet this evening.
So, well, thank you, Jeff, for this introduction. And as a matter of fact, I was planning on asking you this as a first question, because this is obviously the biggest issue that is dominating the world headlines, and that is occupying most of the energy and oxygen in a room when you talk about the world politics. But you did remind me of this big event that we organized together in 2014 on the 100th anniversary of the outbreak of the First World War. And there were people, including Christopher Clark, who was our guest back then, who claimed that that the First World War actually started by the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo. And obviously others gave it a little bit of a different perspective, that there was a bigger issue at stake. So I'm going to use this as a way to enter my first question. The war in Ukraine, the war between the United States, as you say, and Russia, the proxy war that is being fought on the territory of Ukraine. How do you see the origins of this conflict? How did we get here? Why are we on the precipice of a disaster? 90 seconds from midnight on the doomsday clock, if you will.
Yeah, I think it's exactly the right analogy. When did World War I start? Did it start on June 28th with the assassination of the Archduke? Did it start on July 28th with the declaration of war by Austria against Serbia? Did it start 10 years earlier when military alliances were secretly made that led to the triggering of disaster? Of course, there are roots to any conflict. And even the dating that we give to the Ukraine war in most of the Western media is simply false on its surface, but it also disguises the antecedent causes. This war started in February 2014. We say it started in February 2022, typically, that Putin, without provocation, because he's a madman and wanted to recreate the Russian Empire in his fantasies, launched an unprovoked war on February 24th, 2022. That's just propaganda. That's not even factual about when the fighting started, because the fighting started in 2014. Not in 2022, and it raged, actually, between 2014 and 2022. So even the simple fact of when the war started was that it started 8 years earlier. And of course, why the war started 8 years earlier is heavily contested, but I'll give you my 5-minute view, and that is that from 1990 onward, we failed to endorse, adopt, and build on Gorbachev's vision of a common European home, and instead, the U.S. set up a vision of a U.S.-led unipolar world and believed that the Cold War was won by a U.S. victory rather than achieved by a diplomatic settlement. In fact, the U.S. did not defeat the Soviet Union. Gorbachev unilaterally said we should end the Cold War. We want to reform. We're going to disband the Warsaw Pact because we don't want to address our issues through military means. And he was told in 1990, okay, if you do that, Germany wants to reunify, but we commit to not expanding our military alliance, NATO, in place of what was the Warsaw Pact. And a famous promise was made that we will not move NATO 1 inch eastward. And by the way, I always like to say in my talks, if you want documentary evidence, my email is sachs@columbia.edu, and I'll be happy to refer you to the archival material that documents this, because this is all denied now by the United States, which likes a politics of amnesia rather than a politics of memory in this case. So the U.S. promised no NATO enlargement. By 1992, the neoconservatives in the United States, which means the hawkish or war party, was in power. Remember Cheney, Wolfowitz, and Rumsfeld, and then they were followed by the Democratic Party side of the war party, which is Madeleine Albright, Richard Holbrooke, and others. So it's both parties. It's not one party or another party. They said, no, we won. It's a unipolar world. Anyway, Soviet Union's finished. We don't have any commitments to keep. And so Bill Clinton started the NATO enlargement in the mid-1990s. And really smart people knew at the time, this is reckless. This is dangerous. It's a cheat, and it's also a provocation. And so that went on for a long time. By the way, when President Putin came to power in 1999, he was not anti-European. He was not anti-American. He expected cooperation. But he said, stop the NATO enlargement because, you know, we have interests and we don't want your military on our border. Then came 9/11. The neocons went into absolute preeminence. Cheney basically ran the security state of the United States from 2001 to 2008. He was a very dangerous person. He said if there's 1% risk of something, you have to treat it like it's 100% chance. You know, if Saddam has 1% chance of having nuclear weapons, you have to treat it like it's certainty. That's a little crazy, by the way, in decision analysis. You don't treat a 1% as 100%, but you do create a lot of wars if you do that. So all the wars started. And the NATO enlargement continued in 2004, 7 more countries. The Baltic states, Romania, Bulgaria, Slovenia, and Slovakia. And then in 2007, Putin said, no more. So George W. Bush in 2008 said, yes, more. Ukraine and Georgia. This was not prudent. Prudentia is a Latin word meaning practical good judgment. And it comes from a Greek word called sophrosony, which means wisdom. This is not wisdom. This is stupid. And that's what they announced in Bucharest 2008. And many European leaders said to me at the time, what is he doing? We're against this. But one thing, this is the continuing slide into this, and I'll just finish with 2 quick points on this. In 2014, the US helped overthrow the president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych. We know it from many means. I know it because I happen to see things that I wish I hadn't seen. But the US was part of this overthrow. Putin didn't like that either, because Yanukovych was actually rather cleverly trying to balance 2 giants. On the one side, the West saying you must do this and you must do that. On the other side, Russia saying you must do this and must do that. And Yanukovych's position was, we're neutral, thank you, we're neutral. That was rather intolerable to the United States. Neutrality doesn't work in the US mindset, because you're either with us or you're against us. And so they helped to overthrow him in February 2014. That's when the war started. And between 2014 and 2021, there was fighting the whole time, but the US put in billions of dollars of weaponry. And the Ukrainians built fortifications along this line that we're seeing the front line. That didn't just start a few months ago. That was 8 years of fortifying the eastern Ukraine with American finance and know-how and weaponry. So at the end of 2021, after Biden had come into office, Putin said, look, you crossed every red line, but our red line is NATO stops its enlargement. You stop trying to get military bases on our borders. You stop putting weapon systems that can hit us in a few minutes, and we discuss it. And the White House answer was, nothing to discuss. And we're certainly not going to talk about NATO enlargement. And then the war, the invasion came on February 24th, 2022. So if ever there was a series of missed opportunities over 30 years to avoid a conflict, this is it. And that's why I'm deeply unimpressed by an analysis that said this war started on February 24th, 2022 by an unprovoked attack by President Putin. It's just not true. It started because of a buildup of conflict over a 30-year period and lots of cheating, I'm afraid, by the United States side. And that brings us to our mess right now.
So we are, Jeff, where we are right now, and obviously this angle is something that is fiercely opposed by official capital views of the European Union and Washington as well. But the fact of life is that set of very harsh economic sanctions were imposed on the Russian Federation unilaterally by the United States and the European Union. And as both economist and intellectual, what's your take on these sanctions? How effective?
Those are opposites, by the way, economist and intellectual.
Intellectual. Well,
Just to make the point.
try to be both in answering this, but and why do you think that majority of world nations don't seem to have been ready to support this course of action, at least not so far?
First, on the sanctions, you know, the United States uses sanctions a lot. It's an interesting policy. They use it a lot because it's without any direct budget outlay, and it can do a lot of damage. And it doesn't require any public debate. It doesn't require any congressional approval. The public doesn't even understand what it is, but who cares? It's not their business. This is purely the president by signing a document. And the U.S. uses these unilateral sanctions. This is different from sanctions approved by the UN. That's a different matter because the Security Council can vote sanctions under the UN Charter. But this is the U.S. using its sanctions, and they do it a lot. The one thing I would observe about this is they almost never work in geopolitical terms. And I've watched for years the use of sanctions by the U.S. as a cheap, easy policy fail time and again. One was the United States, in one of the most ridiculous foreign policy moves you can imagine, suddenly decided under Trump to declare that the president of Venezuela wasn't the president, but the president that the United States said was the president. So the United States one day announced Maduro is not president, Guaido is president. It's in English we would say pretty ballsy. That you just announce one day who the other country's president actually is. It's a strange kind of foreign policy. Anyway, they said, okay, since Maduro's not president, he can't have any access to foreign exchange reserves anymore. He can't Venezuela won't be allowed to fix its oil drilling and so forth. So by stroke of a pen, they put on these unilateral sanctions. It actually worked in one sense. It completely crushed the Venezuelan economy, which declined by more than 50% in GDP, extraordinary decline. What didn't work is Maduro's still there, of course. And Guaido, by the way, was thrown out even by the opposition saying, no, he's not our president anymore. The whole thing was absurd. It was worse than a high school play, actually. Oh, you're not student council president? He is. Yeah, but he won the vote. No, it doesn't matter. But anyway, they did this, but it didn't work geopolitically. It didn't end Maduro's government. In fact, in a way, he said, look, all this economic crisis caused by the gringos in the north, which was pretty accurate description, after all. It was the United States that did this. So now, by the way, the White House sends its emissaries to Maduro. Would you pump more oil? Because we have to replace the Russian oil. So now they're trying to become buddies with Maduro again. But the point is, it didn't work. And no U.S. sanctions regime that I know of in recent years has come close to working. So that's the starting point. So as soon as the U.S. put on sanctions on Russia, I talked to a very senior official and I said, this isn't going to work. It doesn't work. This time it was worse though, because not only did it not cripple the Russian economy, the boomerang effect, which didn't apply in Venezuela so much, because you could crush Venezuela without the whole world feeling it, applied in the case of Russia, which is it's led to tremendous global negative consequences. So it didn't stop Russia from exporting all over the world. And I'll come to your question, why? But it also hurt Europe a lot because Europe's told, no, you can't buy the low-cost energy that your industry has built upon. So the effects were quite serious, and we haven't seen the last of those effects yet. But when the sanctions were imposed, it was the US and always the Anglo-Saxon world, so that's the US, Canada, UK, Australia, New Zealand. That's a block of the security system of the US. Then the EU, okay? Then Japan, Korea, and Singapore. That's basically it. That's roughly 20% or so of the world population, roughly speaking. Maybe a little bit less, actually. And most of the rest of the world said, we don't want to get into this. We trade with Russia, we trade with Ukraine. We're not party to this conflict. We think this conflict should stop with negotiations. And so most of the world does not want this. Of course, a lot of the world's afraid of the US secondary sanctions, but the vast majority of the world doesn't agree with these sanctions and doesn't even agree with the idea that any country can just decide to impose these sanctions, which are illegal in international law, after all. There's no legal basis for one country to say, stop trading with all those other countries. You can't do that. But they're a little afraid, but they don't impose the sanctions. This is the basic reason why Russian economy has done fine during the past year, because China trades with Russia, India trades with Russia, all the Asian countries trade with Russia, the Latin American countries trade with Russia. Today, Chancellor Scholz has been in South America, and he's being told by the South American leaders, don't pull us into this. We're not going to send arms to Ukraine. They trade with Russia, but they also trade with Ukraine, by the way. They don't want to be in this proxy war. So that's the main reason. And they don't view it like the US thought automatically they would view it, that this is an unprovoked attack. I speak to world leaders all over the world, and they understand full well this is a confrontation of two superpowers, not one side launching a war. And they want both sides to back off. So that's the answer.
So that is my next question. We're obviously in a very dangerous situation. This had very negative effect with the world economy, probably not as negative for Russia as the West had initially expected, but it's definitely a bad thing, causing global inflation, disrupting global chains and all that. We're going to get into that in a moment. But just to finish off the war section, what do you believe needs to be done under the circumstances? Who, in your opinion, should provide leadership for this tragedy to be brought to a halt?
I believe that in December 2021, the way that this war would have been avoided was 3 steps. One was Ukraine's neutrality, so non-NATO, neutral, number one. Number 2, that Russia would continue to hold Crimea, whether by agreement or de facto. Russia views Crimea as a particular matter of national security for a true reason, which is that since 1783, that's the place of its naval base in the Black Sea, and that is central to Russia's national security. And I think that that's true. And the third was that the Minsk II agreement to address the Donbass would be implemented. And the Minsk II agreement came in 2014 and 2015, after the events of 2014, to give autonomy to the Donbass. And that's where the heavy Russian-speaking population is, and that's the site of the war right now. And the idea was that there would be some kind of constitutional autonomy, and this was signed by Ukraine and guaranteed by Germany and France in the so-called Normandy process. It was never implemented. My Ukrainian counterparts tell me, of course we would never implement that. We signed it, yes, but we would never implement it. A few weeks ago, former Chancellor Merkel, who was a guarantor of the agreement, she said, I don't even know whether it's true now what she said or what she said then. She said, no, it was a holding period to allow Ukraine to strengthen itself. We didn't expect it to be implemented, which is a remarkable statement to make because Germany was a guarantor of the agreement. That means that they're supposed to ensure that it's implemented. Whatever the case, those three positions that Putin put on the table at the end of 2021 made sense. They really made sense because not expanding NATO, in my view, is not a concession, it's common sense. Do you actually really want to provoke a conflict or do you want to keep a safe space? I say keep a safe space. So that one wasn't a concession, that just made sense to me. Crimea makes sense to me also, I have to say, that fighting to take it back could lead us to nuclear war, and we should understand the practicalities of this. And what Yanukovych was trying to do in 2011 was to negotiate a long-term lease arrangement with Russia that would last at least till 2041. Well, that would have been smart, but he was under a lot of Western pressure. And then Minsk II, sign, implemented. Well, we turned down that basis. So everything got worse. Everything's worse. Not only have hundreds of thousands of people died, we don't know how many, and massive destruction by now, but Russia annexed 4 regions. Okay, this makes it a lot harder. We don't even know what diplomacy would exactly mean right now. But to my mind, we remain 3 core issues. And the core issues are neutrality or NATO enlargement is one issue. The second issue is Crimea. And the third issue is Donbass, but unfortunately now with the Kherson region and Zaporozhye region thrown into this terrible mix. But what does it mean? In my view, it means that what this war is about is politics. It's not about some crazy, it's not about, in my opinion, Putin thinking he's Peter the Great. It's not about the Western propaganda. It's not about Hitler in 1938. It's actually about NATO and Ukraine and all these issues which have been on the table for 30 years. So we should face them politically. And this is, I think, what Clausewitz meant by his most famous expression, that war is politics with other means. In other words, we're still dealing with politics. So we need to have a political discussion about this right now.
So you mentioned in one of your recent articles that neutral countries, including those of the global south, can play an important role in this. Again, the world has changed tremendously since the beginning of this latest era in the history, and so on and so forth. So you have a different global layout when it comes to economic power. And G7 is on the one hand, and then you have BRICS and the rest of the global south. So how do you see the role of the global south, and BRICS in particular, in balancing out the future of world, both security and economy?
My view is that the whole world plays a role in ending this conflict for one very basic reason. If the world really subscribed to the American and European narrative, that this is an unprovoked war, that there are no issues, that Russia just needs to leave, and that it's horrendous crimes and so forth, if that were the view around the world, the whole world would have joined in the sanctions, and Russia really would not have been able to carry on a war. It wouldn't have changed the regime and so forth, as I mentioned, even with Maduro. But Russia has been able to do what it does because it's got friends all over the world that don't subscribe to the dominant EU-US narrative. They think everybody agrees with them, but that's basically because they listen to themselves. They're not talking with the rest of the world. I am talking with a lot of world leaders who say, yeah, this is a contest between the US and Russia. We don't want to take sides in that. So my point has always been, at least make it clear that this is not a war about NATO enlargement, is what I've said to the US, for example, from December 2021 onward. Say NATO isn't enlarging, and that if Putin invades, there's no provocation for that. Make it clear. No, we won't make it clear. The door is open. It's an open door policy. Well, come on. They can't even win the international support on that because it's quite logical that it is a NATO enlargement war. And they don't say, they won't admit that, or they won't deny that. They won't say anything about it. So this is my point about why these other countries. Let's get things on the record. Is the US wanting to enlarge NATO? If they had any sense at all, they would say no. It was a terrible idea in 2008. And we understand it's a terrible idea. Crosses the red line of a major power that has 1,700 nuclear weapons. Thank you. It wasn't such a good idea. So just like in the Cuban Missile Crisis, we have a compromise to create some space, exactly the way the crisis was solved 60 years ago. If they said that, and there were negotiations that made all of this clear, and the whole rest of the world said, you know, now this makes sense, and we will hold accountable the party that breaks this agreement, then you're talking, because then just willfully invading the other side in complete contradiction to what you've agreed really would provoke a worldwide storm. And that's what I'm basically proposing, which is that there are plenty of countries that are ready to guarantee an agreement, and countries that matter. And let me take the case of China, for example. What is China's position on this war? China does not want this war. Of course, China doesn't want Russia to lose this war and NATO to win, especially because, unbelievably, the Secretary General of NATO today is in Asia to try to make a NATO-Asia alliance against China. Excuse me, what does NATO stand for? North Atlantic. Does it stand for World War III? Does it stand for U.S. Expeditionary Force? No, it stands for North Atlantic. It was to guard against an invasion by the Soviet Union, which I guarantee is not going to happen because it doesn't exist anymore. So why is the Secretary General of NATO, Jens Stoltenberg, in Korea today? Because they have no restraint. Because now NATO wants to take a position against China, which is it's really, okay, I'm coming back to your question. So what does all this mean? Put reasonable terms on the table, agree on reasonable terms, and then reasonable nations will help to ensure those terms. And the reason I was mentioning China is that China has said all along, we want the war to stop, which they really do, and I talk to a lot of Chinese senior officials, but we want Russia's security interests to be respected as well. In the West, that's regarded as ludicrous, but what it really means is no NATO enlargement, which is neither ludicrous nor of uninterest to China, which doesn't like NATO exactly right now, especially since they're traipsing around East Asia to try to organize an alliance against China. So all of this is to say there are lots of important countries in the world that actually want peace. And I mentioned Argentina, Brazil, India, which is president of the G20 this year, China, South Africa. They're not warmongers. They're not anti-Ukraine. They just happen also not to be anti-Russia. And they could help to guarantee a peace. But to guarantee a peace, there has to be a clear agreement. What does each side say? The U.S. side has to say, we will not enlarge NATO. And the Russian side has to say, we will put our troops home. Those are the 2 points. That's observable. And I think the world could help to enforce such a basic agreement.
And obviously, as you mentioned, BRICS as well, Russia's part of BRICS, but the economic equation has changed a little bit. And I found it fascinating today when you were giving this interview to our television, when you said that, I did not know that the combined output of BRICS, economic output of BRICS, is actually equal to the combined output of G7. It's an astonishing figure, which was not the case until only a few years ago. So a significant part of the world economy having the vested interest in underwriting the terms of a lasting peace. This is what you were saying. But let me
just to underscore, the G7, US, Canada, UK, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan, is, according to the International Monetary Fund data, 31% of the world output. The BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, is 32% of world output. Now, don't take these numbers to a decimal point, and there are lots of footnotes to add. This is using what's called purchasing power adjusted prices and so on. But the BRICS are a major part of the world, and geopolitically, really an important part of the world. And as we were discussing, for me, extremely interesting that the 3 countries in a row now, 2023, 2024, and 2025, of the G20 presidency, which is not a small thing because it's 85% of world output, those 20 countries, 19 countries plus EU, will be BRICS countries, actually. This year, India is the presidency of the G20. Next year, Brazil, and in 2025, South Africa. And last year was Indonesia. This is a different kind of world. It's not run by the G7 anymore. It's really run by a much broader group of nations, which is good. It means technology and prosperity and know-how has spread all over the world, which is exactly what we want.
Yeah, but now this gets us into a big debate in the context of this technological progress and generally these shifting geopolitical plates. There are authors, including in the last issue of The Horizons, that argue that this war is actually just a prelude, is just an entry into a much bigger and much fiercer, much more consequential competition of our times, which is the competition between the United States and China. And as a matter of fact, one of the, in my opinion, most knowledgeable Westerners about China, which is former Prime Minister of Australia, Kevin Rudd, also one of the frequent visitors of the CIRSD and a contributor to Horizons, wrote a fascinating piece in this issue, laying out 10 different scenarios for the future of the United States-China relationship. And quite scaringly, I must say, 8 out of those 10 scenarios envisage a war between the United States and China in our lifetime, which is possibly even more dangerous and even more consequential than the proxy war that we have been talking about so far in this conversation. So, Jeff, what is your view on the future of the U.S.-China relationship? Do you think that this coupling is inevitable, that this trend cannot be reversed? And what's currently, after the big COVID drama that brought another dimension into this whole situation, where do you think that the U.S.-China relationship is currently going?
I'll start with, again, the same data that I mentioned earlier, but for the US and China. If you measure output in China and the US at what's called international prices, a common set of prices, or what's called purchasing adjusted prices, the Chinese economy is bigger than the US economy. China is currently about 18% of world output, and the US is about 15.5% of world output. This is a fundamental change from 40 years ago. In 1980, the US was about 21% of world output, and China was about 2.5% of world output. Between 1980 and 2020, China grew at a rate of nearly 10% per year. When you have economic growth at 10% per year, it means your economy doubles in size every 7 years. So in 35 years, it doubles 5 times, or 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2, 32-time increase. And that's basically what happened with China. Why, by the way? Because China started incredibly poor, and it caught up to a significant extent. When you're poor, there's lots of headroom. Electrification, education, building roads, building rail, and that's what China did extremely effectively for 40 years. Excellent economic management for 40 years. And now, they didn't close the gap in living standards, because the living standards, by this measure that I keep referring to, puts China at about 30% of the US level. But since China's 4 times the population, it makes it a larger economy in total. Well, let me just give you the upshot of this. This is freaking out American policymakers. It's what a psychologist or a psychiatrist would call a neurotic reaction. Because no one gave China the permission to be bigger than the United States. And that wasn't supposed to happen. In 1992, the US achieved unipolar status, the sole superpower. And that was supposed to last for many decades. And lo and behold, 30 years later, it ended. And the American reaction is, we are so smart, we are so good, we are so effective that China must really have cheated at every moment. And they really must be our enemy also. This is extremely dangerous. It's either us or them at the top of the world. And only a US-led world is a safe world. Otherwise, we're all going to be destroyed by China. It is, in my view, a fantasy misunderstanding. I'll start again with the basic proposition. China's living standards are about a third of the US. China has decades of economic development to make. China faces major challenges. Population is now starting to decline quite significantly. China will probably be under 1 billion people by the end of this century, possibly 800 million, according to the UN forecasts, which are mechanical, but still showing how significant. China will age very rapidly. There are many, many challenges. China's not out to take over the world. But the U.S. whole vision is U.S. is the world leader. It's the self-image. It's what I'm afraid is taught at the Kennedy School of Government often. Isn't that right?
Yeah, it was
Something like that.
It was in a different.
You don't have to believe what's taught, but it is something that's taught.
I actually did believe a lot of things that I was taught at Harvard Kennedy School, and this is one of the reasons why Jeff and I remain so close up to this day. But the atmosphere was different back at a school. It was easier to disagree. It was a different era. I really enjoyed my time at a very liberal and open institution that was Harvard at the time. I did give a lecture last year at Harvard, and although it wasn't really about the war in Ukraine, I was asked questions by the audience, by the kids in the audience, and I was very diplomatic. I wasn't like Jeff at all. Tonight, Jeff was very
They probably
open.
wouldn't invite me there. So
Yeah, but, I mean, later on, I remember we went for a lunch, the professor and I. I'm not going to name who the professor was, but she.
that's a disguise.
That's
deep
a little
cover.
bit of a disguise. We sat in Harvard Square, and she was whispering at me, saying, "Oh, you should not have said what you said. Are you?"
Oh my word!
And I said, like, I mean, I did not want to make a comment on that, but whispering in a restaurant at Harvard Square, like whispering, I could imagine whispering, in a place like Belgrade or maybe a place like Moscow, whispering so they do not overhear what you say. But whispering at Harvard Square was something that really struck me, that there was an era of change in comparison to the time when I was at Harvard. I had so many other questions to ask, but I'm not even going to go into the origins of the COVID virus. I'm not going to go into the questions of who blew up the Nord Stream, because it would have been too much of me to ask under the circumstances. But I do want to give, every time, I do want to give a chance to the audience to ask questions to Professor Sachs. He has to leave the podium at 6:55 because he has a brief phone call to make. So it gives us about 12 to 13 minutes of questions, and the floor is open indeed. This is not Harvard. This is a free place, so you can ask anything you like to Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And then Mr. I'm going to give a chance to Governor Šoškić to ask the first question. Apologies to you guys in the back. Former governor of the Central Bank of Serbia,
Great.
Mr. Šoškić.
Thank you. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was a pleasure to listen to your points. My question would be the following one. If we assume that this conflict is going to end in a way that's not going to be a defeat, an explicit defeat of Russia, do you see that having any consequences of the future role of dollar as an international currency? And what do you think is going to happen on the US Treasury bond market in the future? Thank you.
Just in a general word about the role of the US dollar. It has been a source of a lot of US power and prerogative. The fact that about 60% of world trade is denominated in dollars and settled in dollars. And the US banking system is the predominant mechanism for clearing transactions. And the SWIFT system, which is how the US banking system settles transactions, is the instrument by which the US excludes Russia, for example, under the sanctions. I believe that in 10 years from now, the role of the dollar will be much, much less than it is today. And in 20 years, we'll have a very different international monetary system. And the US will have lost what was called by de Gaulle an exorbitant privilege, but it will have lost the privilege of having the key currency in the world. I think there are three reasons for this decline that will come, that's already underway. One is that to be the world currency depends on being the predominant economy in the world. And as the US share of the world economy diminishes, it's natural that the role of the US dollar would diminish as well. And we are, as I said, on a gradual, gentle decline, not gentle, but gradual decline of the share of world output due to the US, not mainly because of the US collapse, but mainly because the rest of the world develops economically, like China. So that's one reason. The second reason is much more pertinent to this evening, and that is the US began to weaponize the dollar roughly a decade ago. So it basically began to use the dollar as a geopolitical instrument. And my advice is, if you are a government that isn't getting along too well with the US, hold your reserves in some other currency. Because the US has developed a bad habit of seizing foreign exchange reserves of governments that it doesn't like. And it has done that with Venezuela, with Iran, with Afghanistan, with North Korea, and now with Russia. It views that as an easy thing to do. Stroke of a pen by the president, and your antagonist, your foe, can't use their dollars anymore. We even did that with Afghanistan on the way out, froze all the foreign exchange reserves so that the economy completely collapsed in that impoverished place afterwards. It's nasty, by the way. But more than being nasty, it also is not something you can do over and over again, because other countries start to say, maybe we'll hold our reserves in renminbi, thank you, or maybe we'll hold them in some other currency, thank you. And that's what's happening now. So that's a second reason for why the dollar will decline, because it's not just a money, it's an instrument of geopolitics, which it should not be. You can have one or the other, but you can't have the geopolitical instrument for very long. You won't have the key currency anymore. And the third is technological. I think that transactions will not be settled through commercial banks in the future in anything like the way they are now, because we will have digital central bank currencies, and we don't need the commercial banks in the long term to settle our transactions. Probably the digital renminbi will be a first digital currency, probably for use within China, but then it will start to be expanded internationally. Several other central banks will make digital currencies. This is quite different from crypto. Crypto is you have an electronic account that's nonsense and you think it's going to hold value. It's every day I wake up, sorry to say if you're Bitcoin lovers, every day that Bitcoin has any value at all, I think the world's still crazy. So Bitcoin has no intrinsic value, and it's not a legal reserve currency for anything, and it's not a legal means of payment, and it's not a national fiat currency which can at least settle your debts internally. It's unbelievable that people spend money for this electronic cipher. And this arrest of this kid in the United States should tell you this is a little crazy. But what I'm talking about is something else, which is a central bank currency, because there a digital central bank currency is just a means of clearing payments rather than writing checks like we used to do, or even making electronic ledgers through Venmo we use in the United States and so forth, whichever e-wallet system you use. The central bank can do that, actually. And I think that we'll go to that kind of settlements. And so the U.S. ability to say, we're going to cut you off from SWIFT, so what? So I think in 10 years or 15 years from now, it'll be quite a different international monetary system.
Thank you. One other question, back in the audience, that's...
Good evening. I'm Andrei, a student of international relations. It's really a pleasure to listen to you again. I was in the audience last time you were in Serbia. And my question is, what is your vision of the role of Russia in the future in the conflict of US and China? Thank you very much.
The role of
Russia in the conflict between the U.S. and China.
The role of Russia in the conflict?
Yes.
Look, basically, much of the world, as I say, is going to have trade relations with China because why not? It's a good trading partner. And China will be the world's main trading partner for a significant majority of the world. And Russia is among them, and physically being neighbors, so that Russia can make gas and oil pipelines and provide other raw materials which China doesn't have, makes them very complementary economies. And since the U.S. has designated both of them as enemies, it makes them natural allies. We did the one thing that Zbigniew Brzezinski said never do. Zbigniew Brzezinski was, the geopolitical strategist who in 1997 said how important Ukraine was for this geopolitical competition. But in his book, The Global Chessboard, he says, well, this will be the geographical pivot of Eurasia, but the one thing the United States must never do is drive China and Russia together. And then he says, but this is very unlikely to happen. And so, it's the U.S., you shouldn't declare enemies this way. It doesn't even make sense on your own terms of your own geopolitical competition. And that was Nixon's idea of triangulating between Russia and China, or Soviet Union and China, during the Cold War period. But we did what we were told, oh, that will never happen because it's such a bad idea. So right now, that is a friendship without limits, as they say, because the U.S. is targeting both of them. And the U.S. is talking the European Union into more and more of an anti-China policy. And I just can't believe it that Europe would fall for this. Because Europe, absolutely for its prosperity, needs a good relationship with China. And for a long time in the future, China will be a neighbor of Europe in Eurasia. And so you're actually on the same landmass too. And so having good relations would be a good thing, but not in the US mindset. And so the US has launched a chips war against China. You know, this is incredible, this chips war, just to, oh my God. I need an hour to say what I wanted to say, but I'll say it in 1 minute.
There's one more question.
The US has said, we're going to try to stop the Chinese economy from, you know, modernizing at the front level by restricting the sale of advanced chips. Terrible idea in my view. Completely belligerent. But yesterday, apparently, according to the Financial Times, I don't know whether it's definitive or not, Netherlands said we go along with this. If Europe just follows the US on this, it's not going to defeat China, but it sure is going to boomerang against Europe. It makes no sense. And what Europe should be saying to the United States is, calm down. You're still powerful. We still like you. You don't have to, you know, you're still richer than China per capita. You can calm down. We don't want a war with China too. And that's what Europe should really be saying to the United States for its own good.
Thank you, Jeff. But there's one more question, and I really have to make an exception, because I really don't know what would have happened if I don't allow this, but my wife actually wants to ask a question.
This is a
catches me by surprise, so Natasha Yeremich wants to ask a question.
What is the current situation of climate change, 2020?
Okay, an easy question. Current situation on climate change. It's hot and getting hotter fast. And just to give you a couple of grim realities on this, the rate of warming of Earth on average has been 0.18 degrees Celsius per decade during the last 30 years. So that means that Earth has warmed by about half of 1 degree C over the past 30 years. Earth is now warming currently at about twice that rate, at about 0.36 degrees Celsius per decade. Now, compared to the pre-industrial temperature, the Earth is 1.2 degrees warmer than it was before industrialization. If you take 0.36 degrees C per decade, that means we'll be 1.56 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial 10 years from now. That means we will be above the limit set in the Paris Agreement within 10 years. And according to my favorite climatologist, Dr. James Hansen, who I've relied on.
David Sachs has been writing amazing articles. He's written one about the origins of the war, which I thought was extremely interesting. And I think he wrote one which I personally found both brilliant and insightful and very timely, reminding us all of President John Kennedy's speech in 1963, his so-called peace speech at America University. I think this is by getting the name of the institution correct, in which President Kennedy outlined an approach to maintain peace in the world and peace between powerful countries, great powers, which, if it were followed today, if it was part of the text, the way in which diplomacy is conducted, I think it would have prevented all the kind of crises that we're seeing. Of course, President Kennedy made that speech shortly after the Cuban Missile Crisis, which of course has brought the two superpowers at that time, the United States and the Soviet Union, to the brink. The Soviets were incredibly impressed with it. And of course, in a very important sense, it was the speech that laid the foundation for that process known as détente, which developed over the course of the 1960s and for a time seemed to consolidate peace in the 1970s. So, Jeffrey, do you want to tell us a bit more about this article and about?
Yeah, Alex, thanks for bringing it up. Great to be with both of you. What we learned from 60 years ago is unbelievably relevant and important today. And that period was the height of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the closest we have ever come to nuclear annihilation, though we're heading that direction right now. In the Cuban Missile Crisis, I don't know if everybody realizes we came within 1 or 2 seconds of nuclear war, actually, not because of what Kennedy and Khrushchev were doing, but because of what one captain on a disabled Soviet submarine decided to do when he thought he was under attack by a U.S. Navy, and that was his decision to launch a nuclear-tipped torpedo, which, if it had launched under U.S. doctrine, would have led to an automatic, full-scale nuclear attack by the United States against the Soviet Union, Central Europe, Eastern Europe, and China. The goal of the U.S. attack in such a circumstance was to take out 700 million people. We now know from the physics it would have ended humanity entirely, but we came that close. The order of the captain was countermanded by a senior official who happened to be on the submarine, who said, "I don't think it's a good idea. I think we should probably surface. Maybe we're not under attack." And in fact, that's what they discovered, that Kennedy and Khrushchev had actually reached an agreement for ending the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, the thing to understand about the Cuban Missile Crisis is they compromised. They compromised. All of Kennedy's advisors, almost every single one, said, "Go to war. It's our reputation. We cannot. We can win." Whatever stupidity they said. And Kennedy intuited, this can't be right. This is too dangerous. Khrushchev felt the same way. Even when he had placed the missiles in Cuba, he didn't want war. He wanted to give the U.S. a taste of its own medicine because the U.S. had put missiles in Turkey. So the two of them figured out how to compromise, that Russia or the Soviet Union would remove the missiles from Cuba. The United States would remove the missiles from Turkey. The U.S. would pledge never again to invade Cuba. And on that basis, the two sides would disengage. One really very unpleasant part, it's a little bit carping after you've saved the world, but I'm going to carp just a little bit, was that Kennedy insisted that the U.S. side of the compromise, which was removing the missiles from Turkey, should be kept secret by Khrushchev. And one of the most amazing things in history is that Khrushchev kept that secret. He even lost his job in 1964 because he said to his colleagues, and he wrote in his memoirs, "What, should I have World War III so that I violate the agreement I made?" So he kept the agreement that he had made with Kennedy. Kennedy insisted on the secrecy for U.S. domestic political reasons. Most of Kennedy's own aides didn't realize the compromise that had ended the Cuban Missile Crisis. But I think it's so relevant. If you don't mind, I want to take us back just a couple of years, even before that, because we're in the same situation right now. How did we get to the Cuban Missile Crisis? We got to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 because Khrushchev put in offensive nuclear weapons. But why? Because the United States had invaded Cuba in the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was one of the stupidest American foreign policy moves in modern history. And Kennedy had presided over that. Now, Kennedy was just a beginning president, and the CIA, our most dangerous and failed institution in American history, in my view, had put this harebrained idea on Kennedy's plate and told him, "You have to do this, Mr. President, and it's bound to succeed." And of course, it was bound to fail. And it was a disaster that led to another disaster to another disaster. But the Cuban Missile Crisis came from a U.S. invasion of Cuba. And one of the striking things about that invasion is that when it started, Khrushchev and Kennedy had already established a secret line of communication to each other, a back channel. And Khrushchev wrote a letter to Kennedy, which is incredible to read. It says, Mr. President, piratical elements of your government are undertaking this illegal international operation. Surely you don't know about it. You need to stop it. And Kennedy wrote what I regard as really one of the worst things he did. He wrote back a letter to Khrushchev saying, what? Us? We have nothing to do with this. This isn't the United States. And that was, the direct lying is not good. It can get you into trouble. It can even get you into an end of the world when you're lying to a nuclear superpower. So that actually was the second big lie by an American president to a Soviet leader in a short period of time, because just before that lie and the Bay of Pigs invasion, which was a debacle, was the U-2 spy plane flight over the Soviet Union, where the CIA had told President Eisenhower in his last years, don't worry, they could never hit a U-2. They could never capture it. And if they do, the pilot has a cyanide pill. They'll never be taken alive. And the plane is designed to disintegrate if it's hit, blah, blah, blah. CIA stuff, very typical. Of course, the Soviets shot down Gary Powers in the U-2 spy plane. It derailed all the diplomacy of the day. But even more striking was Eisenhower was told, okay, they couldn't have the pilot, the plane disintegrated, so Eisenhower lied. He stood up and he said, well, that is an American weather plane that went off course from Turkey. And then the Soviets produced the spy plane and produced Gary Powers alive. And so Khrushchev felt, God, these people just lie to your face baldly on matters of fundamental national security. And this is the second time that happened. So if you unwind, it's remarkable. By the way, you can unwind even further, and I think nobody does anymore, but even the Cold War itself could have been diffused in the mid-1950s. And the issue is quite relevant, actually, for Ukraine, ironically. I'm in Vienna. In 1955, Vienna became, again, the capital of an independent country, and the Soviets left voluntarily from their post-World War II occupation because Austria declared neutrality. And the Soviet Union said, okay, neutral, we go. You're not a threat to us. And what the Soviet Union was saying to the United States is, make Germany neutral. Don't remilitarize Germany. Don't make it part of your most advanced military bulwark, because they just killed 20 million of our citizens. And the United States, of course, was completely tone deaf to that. In fact, that's the whole approach of U.S. foreign policy. Don't listen to what the other side says. So George Kennan, who was our really greatest diplomat historian and author of Containment, but he meant containment in a kind of political manner, not in this highly militarized nuclear arms race matter, said in 1957, make Germany neutral, and then the Cold War ends. Then the Soviets can leave Central and Eastern Europe. Then we can have peace. And of course, no one was listening to Kennan at the time, because the U.S. always wants arms races. Okay, so all of that is the background to the 1963 speech, because Kennedy really was a man of peace who found himself at the brink of nuclear war through stumbles, mistakes on both sides. And that's the real truth of Kennedy. He really wanted peace, and yet he almost presided over the end of the world. And he was deeply shaken at the end of 1962. And Khrushchev, who was a real human being, by the way, was deeply shaken at the end of 1962. And both of them corresponded. We got to get off the brink. We have to back off. This is very dangerous. And Kennedy gave this absolutely remarkable speech on June 10, 1963, which is my favorite speech of an American president in modern history, saying we can make peace with the other side. This is the height of the Cold War. Everyone hates the Soviet Union in the United States. All the propaganda, all the anti-Soviet, anti-Russian sentiments that we have today, every day in our newspapers, was even more than, they're out to kill all of us. That was every day. And Kennedy said, no, we can make peace. They are human beings. They want peace the same way we do. They have every reason to abide by an agreement, a peace arrangement that's in their interest as it is in our interest. And then Kennedy said, and we should hail the Russian people for their great achievements in the arts, in culture, in science, in space, in valor, in bravery. Can you imagine? But of course, that's what Biden should be doing if he even gave one speech to the American people about this. Of course, who could ever expect the eloquence or the wisdom of Kennedy right now? We could never expect it. But the amazing thing about that speech, which is why I wrote a book about it 10 years ago, because I love it, the speech was so wise, so smart, so much relevant for a man who had almost stumbled to nuclear war, the absolute opposite of what he wanted. And he knew how dangerous the world is. When the speech was delivered, Khrushchev read the translation, said he called the U.S. envoy, Averell Harriman, who was in Moscow, and said, this is the finest speech by an American president since Franklin Roosevelt. I want to make peace with your president. 5 weeks later, they signed the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. It's an incredible story because I said in my op-ed, it's like a mathematician would say a constructive proof. You don't actually just prove that peace could happen. You show it. You prove it by making it. So the speech led to a peace agreement, and it's completely relevant for what we have today. First of all, Kennedy knew both sides had led to the war. Both sides had led to the near global destruction. Both sides needed to back off. Both sides wanted peace. And this is where we are today. Exactly the same thing, except we have this drumbeat, crazy drumbeat in the media, which you two so wisely talk about every day and report on, which is insane. By the way, led by the British. I respect the British. You speak English so much better than we do. It's yours. But this Russophobia in Britain is so deep. It's about 200 years old. It's so simple-minded. I used to even read The Guardian, by the way. Now I can't even go to the website. It's unbelievable. By the way, that's how our New York Times is. It's unreadable. It's phony. It's propaganda from morning till night. It's so completely one-sided, and no one tells the history of anything. And I tried to publish that piece in the New York Times. Well, they rejected it in 10 seconds. And more than that, I tried to publish anything in the New York Times, and they said no. What they want to say is it's an unprovoked invasion, and we're facing a madman, and there's no one to talk to, and war is the only way, and NATO enlargement is the only way, and diplomacy can't work, and every lesson of history is ignored. That's where we are.
That's where we are indeed. And in fact, you've been also writing about the fact that the invasion was most definitely provoked. This is not something that came out of a blue sky. It's not that Vladimir Putin got up one morning and said, let's invade Ukraine now. In fact, we have a whole pattern of US and Western and British, and you're absolutely right in everything you say about Britain. I live here, so I should know. And I am British, so I should know.
And you speak such beautiful English, I want to say. So,
thank you. But here we are in this situation, and we have played a huge contribution going all the way back to the time when you were in Moscow. You've already discussed the fact that you weren't getting the support then from the US government that you needed in order to do the kind of things that could have been done, which might have consolidated peace then. and change the political situation. And of course, there's no recognition of that today, none at all. I mean, everything that happened at that time isn't discussed, and the enlargement of NATO isn't discussed. And it's almost heresy to suggest that it had any contribution, had any role in the start of the war at all. You want to say anything quickly about that before?
Yeah, I just want to say that,
Yeah.
one of the biggest problems, and it's pervasive, is the US government lies about everything and lies relentlessly. It's not the only one. British government does the same and other governments do the same, but the lying is non-stop. So we don't really even know, except by trying to parse the, whatever evidence or crumbs or leaks or whistleblowers tell us what's really going on, what is going on. But what we do know now is how America's top diplomats for 30 years warned against the American policy approach. And one of the most important warnings that everyone can find online is a memo by our current CIA director, William Burns, who in 2008 was the US ambassador to Russia. And he wrote a memo called Niet means Niet. And it was, that is a red line to extend NATO to Ukraine. And he said, it's not just Putin, it's the entire political class. It doesn't matter, pro-Putin, anti-Putin, all Russian leaders say Niet means Niet. Now, the reason I mentioned secrecy in this context, we never even know about this except for WikiLeaks. Because the American people, who should tell the American people what our top diplomat in Russia thinks about the most crucial issue that could get us all killed? The American people, they're completely incidental to this story. No one tells them anything, and no one admits anything. And so there's been so much lying about the failure of negotiations. Why did the negotiations break down in March 2022? Because the US stopped Ukraine from agreeing with Russia on neutrality. How do we know that? Because I know it because people have told me that were involved in the negotiations, but I also know it because Naftali Bennett, who was an informal mediator, happened to blurt it out in an interview, which is quite fascinating to look at because it's a little weird how just open he talks. He says, yeah, we were reaching an agreement. We were in the 7th draft. They were about to sign. Then the United States came in and stopped it. And by the way, you know why he says they stopped it? Because, well, I disagreed, Bennett says, but, they wanted to look tough to China. Are you kidding? This is a war not even about Ukraine. It's about China, and not even about China, but about looking tough to China. And by the way, Stoltenberg, who really is someone I've known for a long time, and he is I can't even say it publicly anymore, what I think about him, even though I used to be friends with him when he was Prime Minister of Norway. Disgusting. But today he says, we can't look soft because China will see us looking soft. This is the way to get us all killed, by the way. But I want to come back to the secrecy point. We wouldn't know what these diplomats said, except that they get leaked or they get released, or once in a while, one of them reflects after the fact in their memoirs how dangerous the time was. William Perry tells us afterwards, I thought about resigning because of NATO enlargement. I was so much against it. It was so dangerous. But then I thought maybe I shouldn't resign and so forth. He's a wonderful man. He should have resigned. The public should have understood this much earlier. But these things are not told. And we never got an accounting of why the negotiations broke down in March 2022. So the mainstream media just go completely silent. They don't even ask a question. And it's this secrecy which allows a small group, Biden, Newland, Blinken, Sullivan, I'm sure, obviously Raytheon and others are happy in the military-industrial complex and the Armed Services Committee, they're happy. But it's a tiny group that is calling these policies. And these are crazy policies, and they're absolutely dangerous. And I think the Cuban Missile Crisis, to come back to that, taught us, most of the opinion of these elites, which was always pointing to war solutions, would have gotten us all killed. And that's why it's so crazy that we're in the situation we're in right now. One mild saving grace is that all the European pro-war leaders are unpopular and becoming more and more unpopular, and Biden is very unpopular. So none of this is winning any political support. And if they actually took the issue to the people in our countries, the public would be dead set against what we're doing right now, because we're gambling with Armageddon, to quote a title of a wonderful book about the Cuban Missile Crisis, for no reason, because we could have reached peace in December 2021 when Putin put absolutely valid, real propositions on the table that should have been negotiated. The U.S. rejected that. We could have reached peace in March 2022 when they came close to signing an agreement that the United States stopped, and we could reach peace now, even now. But they don't want to negotiate.
Because this is the problem. They don't want to negotiate, and then by not making negotiations possible now, it seems to me that they're making negotiations more difficult in the future.
Of course, everything gets harder. Everything gets harder. And, in 2021, in December 17, when President Putin put the U.S.-Russia security agreement on the table, there was no talk, by the way, about territory at that time or about annexation of Lugansk and Donetsk and so forth. This was about the Minsk II agreement, an agreement that was reached, not only signed by Ukraine, but actually endorsed 15-0 by the UN Security Council. And more than that, guaranteed, quote unquote, by France and Germany. Russia wasn't making demands to annex territory. Everything becomes harder when you have war. This is clear. That's why these guys, it's so mindless. And by the way, I think I mentioned to you, I called the White House after Putin put those propositions on the table. I was able to have my say for an hour, but I was told point blank, we will not negotiate over NATO. And I told them, you're going to have war. This is absolutely reckless. So there we are.
Do you get the sense that there is a policy debate now underway in Washington and that the wind is starting to change? I've started to see articles appearing. I mean, there was Mr. Charab. I don't know whether you know him, but
yeah,
he does seem
I
to
don't
be
know
an interesting.
Personally.
He does seem to be an interesting man, and he's making some comments now. He talked about an unwinnable war in Ukraine. You get the sense that I get the sense that, of course, this is from London. It's a long way away here in London from what's going on in Washington. But I do get the sense that there are some people who say this is going too far. We've invested too much in this. It is getting too unpredictable. It is going on for too long. And we've had other articles appearing. There was a very I didn't like the article, but it was in Politico about, our military position is depleting, all of those sort of things. I mean, do you get the sense that there is now some doubt starting to grow in some parts of the American government, and that this might eventually lead us back to some kind of a compromise, even if not perhaps quite as coherent a compromise as the one that President Kennedy came to in the 1960s?
So first, it's interesting to say about Rand. Rand is solid U.S. defense. I mean, that's how it was set up for the U.S. Air Force and so on. But interestingly, and I've followed Rand obviously for 40 years, they do honest analysis, which is interesting because there are very few places where you get honest analysis. So that article is insightful. That guy is quite insightful. Rand has been telling us for years, as you've been reporting, and as we know, don't get into a long war. It's not in American interest. And so Rand, I give a lot of credit to Rand for, in the midst of all of this complete mindless politicization, to actually do analysis. This is quite different from, say, British intelligence, what garbage passes for what's claimed to be. This is real analysis. So I think that is first important to note. Washington is so pathetic right now. First of all, it's all geared towards nothing but 2024. So we're constantly in election mode. Election mode means money mode, and it means lobbying mode. So it's never really an honest debate. If there's a debate, it's about what does this mean for Biden's reelection? What should he do for Biden's reelection? It's not an analytical debate. It's not how do we save the world debate. It's spin. What do we say? How do we maneuver? Of course, there are different points of view. A lot of people could see this is not working out very well. But things are driven so relentlessly by very short-term theatrical considerations that I wouldn't give a lot of hope to kind of high-minded rethinking. Who knows? But what I see is a tremendous concentration on spin and on posturing, and that is not conducive to strategy. Incidentally, by the way, even when Kennedy gave that peace speech, he hid the text of the speech from the State Department, from the Defense Department, from the security establishment until the day before, because he knew he did not want the speech stopped. So you have to have really a clever, energetic, properly directed president to begin with. And I don't think Biden fits any of that description right now. To even be able to break free of what is this overwhelming war machine. And you need to have a mind that's somehow above the spin cycle. And I don't see that right now. What I do think is absolutely happening is a consolidation of about 80% of the world in favor of negotiations. And that, to my mind, makes a very big difference. And we've discussed this, and you've been discussing this. The fact that it's not, it's China, that's hugely important. Indonesia, that's not a small thing, by the way, that the Indonesian government put on the table a peace plan. Lula, not unimportant at all, quite important, because Lula brings together the whole leadership of South America. The dynamics in the Middle East, the African leaders saying, come on, you're choking us with this. We need peace. I think what is slowly dawning on the policy types in the United States and Europe is, the world's not with us. In fact, more than that, the world's actually against us. Because for a while they were saying, well, they voted 140 countries, and now they're kind of understanding it's much worse than that. Europe's diplomacy is collapsing internationally. Europe is viewed as a small appendage to NATO. It's uninteresting for almost all the world because nobody sees anything coming out of Europe except basically parroting the U.S. line. And the U.S. is seen for what it is, which is, most of the world saying, we don't want to be led by you. Thank you. We'd like to trade with you. We'd like to cooperate. We don't want to be bombed by you. Thank you. But we don't want to follow you or have your sanctions regime and so on. And so all of this means that over time, the viability of this whole approach, the U.S. hegemonic approach, the NATO enlargement approach, the war approach, even for the military logistics and armament side, it's less and less viable. I don't think the U.S. will be the first one to break ranks on this, actually, because of our strange, corrupted politics. But I do think that the weight of the world opinion really coming together to say, come on, stop already, is actually going to one way or another, make the difference. I hope it makes the difference before we get things completely out of hand. And, to come back to where I started, there's in a nuclear confrontation, in a nuclear age, 1,600 deployed nuclear weapons on both sides, a lot of not so very clever people in the U.S. leadership. You just can't be complacent day by day thinking it's somehow all going to come out right, because there are too many stupid people around, too many irresponsible people. That's why I'd like to get us to the negotiations as fast as possible, not give time for what I know is complete irresponsibility. By the way, when I've been at Harvard and trained, I've seen how these people get trained. I want to negotiate. Let me put it that way.
We're now at 33 minutes. So I think, Jeffrey Sachs, this is where I stop. I don't know whether Alex wants just to quickly.
Well, do you have five minutes?
Yeah, I can stay for 5 more minutes.
For a few questions.
Great to talk to you guys.
Great. Real quick, a lot of people are asking, where can they follow your work and your articles that you publish? Where's the best? What's the best way?
There's a website, jeffsachs.org, I think.
Yes, I have that. I put the link.
jeffsachs.org. I think it's jeffsachs.org.
Yes.
That's the best place, because everything gets posted there. So it's really easy.
Okay, great. So
Good.
a lot of
Thanks
people
for
were
asking
asking
that.
Yes, a lot of people were asking that. And we have a question from Pamela. Jeffrey, I despair that Trump, Kennedy, and the West have all said very disparaging things about Putin, and without exception, I would say they all believe in American exceptionalism. Are you more optimistic than I am?
I've talked to Robert Kennedy Jr. Recently on several occasions, and he knows we need a peaceful approach. He knows that this war in Ukraine is extremely dangerous, and that we need negotiations. He understands the legacy of his uncle and his father, and I think that that's extremely important. We discussed the peace speech, of course. I did also with his sister, Carrie Kennedy, whom I adore and very much respect. In fact, when we had a gathering in Rome last week on the occasion of this speech, it was a little bit amazing, because we had Carrie Kennedy, the niece of JFK, daughter of Robert Kennedy. We had Nina Khrushcheva, the granddaughter of Nikita Khrushchev, and we had Gillian Sorensen, who's a UN leader and the widow of Theodore Sorensen, who was the speechwriter of the speech. So I thought it was an absolutely grand reunion. But I just would say that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is extremely intelligent and very much peace-seeking. And very much in the Kennedy tradition of peace-seeking.
All right. Rafiq Adams actually asked the question, so what is your views of RFK Jr., his candidacy? But he also says, the longer we delay negotiations, the greater the possibility Russia will impose its own solution, perhaps all the way to the Polish border. Is it realistic to wait for new U.S. elections?
Well, I don't think it's realistic to wait, period. That's why every day I say we should negotiate. I really find it shocking that since February 24th, 2022, as far as I know, there hasn't been one phone call between Biden and Putin. What kind of world is this? If they want a link, I can send them a Zoom link. They can talk to each other. I mean, what is the point of not talking? You might not agree. You might really violently disagree, but that's a verbal disagreement. I mean, the violence is on the battlefield. Talk to each other, for God's sake. That's what is shockingly missing. And there's so much to say about this, but one of my favorite lines of JFK was from his inaugural address, where he said, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. And come on, pick up the phone, Joe. Call Vladimir, talk. Because, President Putin has some real points that you need to discuss, and you can make your points and find a way out of this. So don't wait. And also, I'm an economist. I'm not a military guy. I'm quoting you, Alexander. So, but I know in economics, what is often said is, well, we have to wait, or things need to get worse before they get better. This is the stupidest advice. I've been involved in problem solving for 40 years. You don't wait for things to get worse so they can get better. Generally, when things get worse, they get worse after that. Things spiral out of control. Panics happen. Unexpected consequences. By the way, most unexpected consequences could be expected if you think about them hard enough, but most people don't, so they become unexpected consequences. We should not wait. Today, President Biden should pick up the phone and call his counterpart, and they should say, look, this is a terrible situation. We have terrible disagreements, but we're going to talk to see if we can find a way out of this. Because once they start hearing from each other, there actually are valid points to be exchanged between the two sides. And so that's why I said when President Putin put his draft agreement on the table on December 17, I immediately called the White House, said there's a lot of good in there and a lot that's negotiable. And by the way, the main point I made was not expanding NATO is not a concession. It's just prudence. It's not giving up something. It's just common sense, for God's sake. So it's not a concession. And don't wait till the next election. Definitely don't wait. Let's get the negotiations going now.
Absolutely. We'll do 2 more questions. Elza asks how to negotiate. March 2023, you won't give depleted uranium to Ukraine. June 2023, U.S. wants to give depleted uranium to Ukraine. So how do you negotiate?
It's even more shocking than that, because there was a Washington Post story a week or two ago, and the headline was something to the effect that Biden increasingly ignores every Russian red line. And then the whole story was these idiots, sorry to say, in Washington saying, well, Putin's bluffing, so now we know we can go farther, we can go farther, we can go farther, until, oops, okay, there goes the world. What are we doing? What are we doing? Of course, we're violating every statement that we've made. Things escalate in wars. And we have a war machine in the United States. And then we have, Stoltenberg and all the spin masters and everyone else saying, oh, if we, compromise, we'll lose face with China, as if this is about China, and if, this is really going to determine something about China. It's mindless. But when you ask the question, how can you negotiate? President Kennedy said in the peace speech, both sides have incentives to agree to terms that are beneficial for each and to stick with those terms. So you make agreements that make sense. That's how to do it, not imposed agreements, but agreements that make sense. And I think that there is plenty of space for such agreements. That's the point. I have thought all along over the last 30 years, the last thing in the world we need is a confrontation between the United States and Russia. And again, I was Yeltsin's economic advisor in 1992. Yeltsin was saying, we want to be friends, we want to be normal, we want to be fully economically integrated. The United States could not hear yes for an answer. This goes back 30 years. Yeltsin, I know it, he said it to my ear. We want to just be normal country, we want to have good relations. The United States, it goes in one ear, and the United States says, oh, I see, you want a unipolar, US-led hegemonic world. That, we get it. This is how it gets processed in the American mental machinery of the military-industrial complex. So there are grounds for negotiating that are mutually beneficial. Russia actually would benefit from peace. The United States would benefit from peace. Europe would benefit from peace. The rest of the world would benefit from peace. Ukraine would be saved. That's why it's good that we negotiate, because there's a space for mutual gain for all parties.
Yeah, absolutely. Controlled Demolition says the Cuban Missile Crisis happened because we had to put missiles in Turkey and resolve it. And to resolve it, those missiles were removed.
The Cuban Missile Crisis happened because things were spinning out of control in the late 50s and early 60s over Cuba, over the failure to have actually a treaty that ended World War II, over the remilitarization of Germany, over a harebrained scheme at the time, by the way, which is little understood, but the best historians understand this very well. The Eisenhower administration was toying with giving nuclear weapons to Germany. And we have that today. We have Zelensky sometimes saying maybe we should have nukes, and others saying the same thing. Well, this is a sure way to end the world if we start with that. But in the late 1950s, this was actually on the table. And when the United States started to pull back from giving nukes to Germany, thinking maybe it's not such a great idea, actually de Gaulle came forward to Adenauer and said, we'll make a good agreement with you guys, and we could discuss that issue as well. So there were a lot of games being played. In the early 1960s, it was an extremely, extremely dangerous period. At the root of it was, I believe, that the United States and the Soviet Union never talked about the fundamental security interests at the end of World War II. And there was never a peace agreement about Germany. There was just a decision starting in 1948. There will be a Federal Republic of Germany, a West German state, and NATO will be established 1949. Germany will become the bulwark of NATO. We will remilitarize on our side. And by the way, this idea is so commonplace, almost no one in the United States would say, well, that's not why the Cold War happened. The Cold War happened because of Stalin and this and that. But actually, if you really study this, if you listen to Kennan, if you read Mark Trachtenberg, brilliant history of the Cold War, you can see Russia, I'll say Soviet Union, had deep security concerns, completely understandable after losing more than 20 million people. And the United States was completely unwilling to discuss them. And that is a core structural feature of the world since 1945 until today in Ukraine. The United States, for lots of reasons, mainly arrogance, is unwilling to accept that any other country has security concerns. The United States has a big security concern. It wants to be number one in the world. But then if any other country says, well, we have security concerns, the United States says, no, you don't. How could you? We're peace-loving. We run the world. How could you have security concerns? And that has been a problem actually since 1945. And that is also where we are today.
And I think perhaps, so one more, did you say?
One more, because that's a great segue into our final question, which is on the screen right now, which is how do you see the U.S. Future, given everything that's happening right now?
That's a good question.
It's a big question.
It's basically this. I'm 68. The U.S. has been at war almost every year of my life. My political consciousness, my first political awareness actually was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It may sound odd. I was 7 years old at the time, but I remember looking at airplanes flying above my primary school and telling a friend, maybe they're coming to drop bombs on us. That was my understanding in October 1962. I remember the height of the Cold War. I marched against Vietnam. We learned about Cambodia, about Laos, places that I've spent my career visiting and working in, and not being able to walk in the fields because of American landmines that are still completely strewn across Cambodia, and the United States doing goddamn nothing to help them get rid of these landmines that came from this completely reckless and illegal bombing more than half a century ago. And then the wars in Latin America, which I know a lot about. A president said to me, "They're going to take me out, Jeff." And I said, no. And he was overthrown in a coup, U.S. coup, afterwards. I've seen this with my own eyes for decades. It's very despairing, very despairing. And of course, I've tried to say for decades, there's a better way. This doesn't help the U.S. at all. It really doesn't. We have so many problems. We rank somewhere between 40th and 50th in the world in life expectancy right now. Can you imagine? We've had years of decline of life expectancy. This is a society that's falling apart in many ways. On my street in New York, there's shootings on both ends of the street right now. It's unbelievable what's happening. And we want more war. We want bigger military budgets and so on. Now, when I say we, the basic problem is the American political system got hacked and ruined systematically 40 years ago. Yeah, not everything was great beforehand, but the spigots of big money were turned on by design. Actually, it's a fascinating story that the corporate sector was worried about the New Deal and all the environmental regulations and worker safety regulations and so forth. And a corporate lawyer, Lewis Powell, wrote a memo about how the companies needed to retake American politics. And Richard Nixon put him on the Supreme Court. And his opinion was, okay, all corporate political giving is free speech. They completely broke a political system of one person, one vote to make it $1, one vote. And we parceled out the American political system to big lobbies. In health, we have our big health care, so everything's twice as expensive as it should be. In finance, we have Wall Street, which dominates. We get 2008 financial crisis and so forth. Foreign policy got parceled out to the military-industrial complex. This isn't a U.S. foreign policy. It's a very narrow foreign policy of a piece of the government that responds to very particular interests. And we did the same in many other sectors, big oil, and the same thing. So the American political system is broken. That's our problem. We can't solve problems right now. It's too much money. It's not Democrats and Republicans, by the way. That's theater. That's the theatrics. Both parties take money from the billionaires. George Soros just said that he's given his empire to his son. His son said, well, I'm going to make massive contributions to the Democratic Party. Well, they're billionaires in the Republican Party. This is the game right now. And this is why it's really amazing. Now, where does optimism come in? Most of the world says, do your thing, but actually we'd like economic development, climate safety, healthcare, other things. So most of the world is really saying right now, look, United States, fine. As I said, don't bomb us. Don't expect us to do your sanctions regime. But come on, don't break the whole world. And let's actually solve some problems in the world. And I'm very enthusiastic about progress that's being made in many places in the world. I love this agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran, by the way, because I've been going for years.